Hello and welcome to Communication 2213 on interpersonal communication. This is our very first chapter. In this chapter, we'll be looking at interpersonal communication as a process. If you took Communication 1013, the introduction to human communication, you came across that word process. And what we mean by that word process is that communication is ongoing, is continuing. It has a certain dynamic, and it's always changing. So in that light, we'll be looking at human communication from that perspective. So why should we study communication? Well, it's something we've been doing all of our lives, but there are certain things we can learn about communication that can help improve our personal lives, as well as improve our professional lives. We can be better communicators than we are now. I think even if you would stop and think a moment about how you have developed your sense of communication since you were a child, and how you continue to mold and shape that communication process as you continue to become better acclimated to our community and our culture. In the first section of our text, we talk about why we communicate. One of the things that is pointed out in the very first part of that chapter is that we communicate in order to meet specific needs that we have. Among those are physical needs, identity needs, social needs, as well as practical needs in our daily lives. Physical needs, as you know, relates to the things that we need in this world, such as shelter, food, clothing, those kinds of things that we need. Those are our physical needs. And then we have identity needs. Our identity needs deals with who we are as human beings and where do we fit into the larger community of humanity. Social needs is how do we live in a good way with other people, and meeting our social needs and our needs for acceptance, our needs for inclusion in other situations as well. The fourth need are practical needs. These are also met through communication. These are our needs that we, for example, getting a haircut or going to the grocery store, those practical needs that we have in our communication come to play here in this aspect as well. Of course, we also are aware of the dark side of communication and how we try to meet our needs. Social needs are represented in research on loneliness and the internet. Connecting with others online can help alleviate some of those lonely feelings. And then there's a preference to connect with others online can also lead to problematic internet use and increased loneliness. And again, those are some of the issues that we will be looking at as we discuss communication. Also, we look at communication and our career achievement and advancement. It's important that we know how to communicate very well in the workplace, as well as in our own personal lives. In the second part, we look at communication process. Communication is defined as using messages to generate meaning, and it is a complex process with many different factors. Throughout time, we've had different kinds of models of communication. The first model of communication began with what the text refers to as the archer's communication. In other words, it's a sender transmitting a message to another person. There's no interaction with the other person. The archer idea there of shooting an arrow is that. That's basically the kind of communication that most of our human history has been wrapped around that kind of communication. So you think back to letter writing, you think back to earlier technology and communication such as the telegraph, was simply sending a message from one person to another person. From that model, we moved to what the text refers to as the tennis game match. And that's where, like two tennis players, you're hitting, one hits the ball to the other returns it. So it's that kind of model of communication that we've also worked with. As a matter of fact, that's basically the traditional kind of model that we've used of the sender, message, and receiver. And then again, this receiver has to process information and has to make some kind of feedback to the sender. The model that we'll be focusing on in this class is called the transactional model. Unlike the previous model, the tennis playing model, in this model, sending and receiving messages are usually simultaneous. So if you think in terms of having a face-to-face conversation with someone, one person is doing the speaking and they're using verbal and nonverbal communication in order to put across their ideas, put across the message to the receiver. But the receiver is also not only receiving the message, the receiver is also communicating messages back at the same time. So the sending and receiving of messages are simultaneous, or going on at the same time. It may be facial expression, it may be gestures, it may be body posture, it may be the nodding of the head. Those are the kinds of ways in which the receiver is also transmitting messages back to the sender. The other thing that we keep in mind is that meanings exist in and among people. Stop and think about that for a moment. When we talk about communication, what I say to somebody, I may mean one thing, but the other person has to interpret that meaning. So the meaning is mostly dependent upon how you, as a receiver, interpret the meaning. In other words, you're giving meaning to the message itself. The third characteristic are the environmental and noise effects have upon communication. And again, environmental also means not only time and place, but it also means relationship. It means context. In where are you at in a particular point of time? Is it a public forum? Is it a private forum? Just exactly what is happening as you are communicating that message to the receiver. One of the things that I thought was interesting in the text was that communication channels influence messages, and one of the things that they've looked at is the sending of tweets. Here they make a couple of observations on tweeting as opposed to email or other kinds of messages. Research shows that Twitter messages are created on a mobile device differ from those created on computers. I never thought about that. That's new information to me. The second thing that they find is that mobile tweets are more egocentric and negatively worded than computer-generated tweets. And those are interesting things to understand, that the channel of how we send a message may also affect not only the effectiveness of the message, but just exactly how is that what does that message mean? How do I interpret that message? So what are some of the principles that we want to focus on as we look at interpersonal communication? First of all, communication is transactional. That's where we get the transactional model. Communication is a dynamic process that the participants create through their interaction with one another. Second thing is that communication can be intentional or it can be unintentional, as all behavior has communicative value. We cannot not communicate. So we from that perspective, we are always in the process of communicating something. The third principle that we need to keep in mind is that communication is irreversible. It is impossible to unsend or to unreceive a message, as words and deeds, once said or done, are out there in the world permanently. They are irretrievable, and I'm sure that you are very aware of that in some of the messages and some of the ways that you've communicated, or some of the things that you've said or sent to others and their impact after a second thought. The fourth principle is that communication is unrepeatable, because the same words and behavior may have different outcomes each time that they are spoken or that they are performed. The next one is that communication has a content and a relational dimension. The content dimension involves the information being explicitly discussed, while the relational dimension expresses how you feel about the other person. I would add to that not only how you feel about the other person, but what is your relationship with the other person. And so we talked in human communication in 1013, we talked about how that relational aspect has an important is important to how we communicate with one another. One of the things that is pointed out in the nature of communication or of interpersonal communication is to think of communication on a continuum, moving from impersonal to interpersonal. So some of the things we want to keep in mind is that every communication process is unique. It is constantly changing. It's constantly bringing about new understanding and new meanings. In the third section of the chapter, we look at the communication competencies and how the communication competence principles apply. The first principle that is mentioned is that competent communication is effective. It has an effect on other people, or is an effective way. Second, it is appropriate, saying the right things for the right audience in the right situation. Third, there is no single ideal or effective way of communicating, and so it's important that we have a repertoire of various ways in which we can communicate, and we can send messages and receive messages. Next, communication is situational. And finally, competence can be learned. And that's really what we're about here in this class, is learning how to be more competent in our communication principles. So characteristics of competence, a large repertoire of skills, I just mentioned that. The ability to adapt, adaptability, the ability to perform skillfully, and in order to have empathy and perspective taking. It's also cognitive complexity. It's also self-monitoring in how we communicate with others. In the fourth section of the chapter, we look at social media and interpersonal communication, very timely and very relevant to our day and age. Social media collectively refers to or describes all of the technological channels that we use in order to communicate. And again, to think in terms of communication, in going from leanness to richness, there's also a asynchronicity, which means that we're not always the response is not always at the same time as the sender, so there's a detachment there, and then also understanding social media and its permanence. So that's the large part of the presentation for today. In class on next Monday, we will talk a little bit more about social media and relational quality. So we're going to look over that section in the text. There is also in your textbook or in the text, there's a survey that you can take that helps you to understand your own communication competency. All right, then, we're going to call it right there. We'll see you later.